Imagine, you're standing outside the damp stone walls of a prison in 1808. The Spanish sun has dulled behind storm clouds, and beyond those iron bars sits a king. But this isn't a king crowned in triumph. He is a captive of Napoleon, a pawn in an empire's game. And yet, beyond those gates, an entire nation still worships his name. Ferdinand el Deseado, the Desired One. They believe he will return as a savior. But what returns is not salvation. It is something far more terrifying. They called him Ferdinand VII, son of the Bourbon Dynasty, heir to Charles IV. But to those who lived under his reign, his name would come to mean something else entirely. Betrayal. Sadism. The slow suffocation of a nation beneath the weight of a single man's appetite. We begin not with glory, but with captivity. In the year 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte, the self-proclaimed Emperor of Europe, invaded Spain. The royal family, caught in its own web of scandals and incompetence, collapsed like a rotted roof. Ferdinand was arrested and taken to France, and there, in the Château de Valenciennes, he remained, a guest in name, a hostage in truth. But as Spain burned in war and rebellion, the myth of Ferdinand only grew. In the villages and taverns among the guerrilla fighters and royalists, his image took on a near-messianic glow. They called him El Deseado, the Desired, not for what he had done, but for what he represented. A return to order, to tradition, to moral clarity in a time of madness. They did not yet know the madness he carried within him. By 1813, under mounting resistance and British intervention, Napoleon crumbled in Spain. The French withdrew, and Ferdinand returned. What the people expected was a king forged by suffering, someone who had seen his homeland's pain and emerged wiser. What they got was something darker. Ferdinand disembarked in Valencia to cheers and tears. But within days he tore up the liberal constitution of 1812, the very symbol of Spain's hope for modern governance. He declared absolute monarchy restored, dissolved the Cortes, and had liberal politicians arrested, tortured, and executed. The people who had fought and bled to bring him home were now enemies of the crown. And yet, the true horror had not even begun. Behind palace walls, Ferdinand's reign became something more than repression. It became performance, a theater of cruelty, where the suffering of others was not just permitted, but savored. He turned inward, away from the affairs of state, and toward his own decaying desires. Like a king from myth, detached from reality, Ferdinand surrounded himself with flatterers, informants, and sycophants who fed his every whim. His body grew bloated, his mind twisted by years of fear, humiliation, and unchecked power. He had tasted captivity once. Now, he would make an entire nation feel what he had felt. This was no ordinary tyranny. It was something older, something primal, a monarchy not built on laws or divine right, but on the naked will of a man who saw no boundary between crown and craving. The priests blessed him. The courtiers obeyed him. The people, silenced by terror or seduced by nostalgia, let the illusion hold. But history remembers, not with reverence, but with a shudder. Ferdinand VII began his reign as a prisoner of France. He ended it a prisoner of his own excesses, his body swollen with gluttony, his palace thick with secrets, and his kingdom shattered by corruption and despair. This is not the story of a flawed king. It is the story of a man who weaponized power to indulge every impulse. A man who used the throne not to lift a nation, but to crush it beneath his feet as he laughed. This is the story of how hope became horror, and how Spain, in its most desperate hour, opened its arms to a monster. To understand the monster, we must return to the cradle. Ferdinand VII was born in 1784, not into strength, but into whispers. The Spanish Bourbon court, already weakened by inertia and indulgence, was a palace of illusions. His father, Charles IV, wore the crown, but not the authority. That belonged to someone else. That someone was Manuel Godoy, a soldier-turned-statesman who climbed the royal ladder not through nobility or merit, but by becoming the lover of the queen. Maria Luisa of Parma, Ferdinand's mother, was known for her dominance and volatility. Rumors swirled that Godoy was more than her advisor. He was her confidant, her controller, her secret consort. And young Ferdinand, he was caught in the middle. Imagine growing up in a palace where your father is weak, your mother is feared, and the real decisions are made by a man everyone mocks behind closed doors. Ferdinand was no golden child. He was awkward, withdrawn, and intensely self-conscious. In his eyes burned not curiosity but suspicion. The court, instead of nurturing him, treated him like a symbol. He was a political chess piece, passed between factions vying for favor. He was educated by clergymen and sycophants, fed a strict Catholic conservatism that taught obedience, suppression, and the divine right of monarchs, but not wisdom, nor empathy. His childhood was a slow boil of humiliation. While Godwin paraded through court with silk uniforms and royal influence, Ferdinand nursed a deep resentment, not only for the prime minister, but for his own family. He was taught to despise liberalism, to fear the mob, and to treat women not as partners, but as objects of control or suspicion. He grew up watching power manipulated through sex, favor, and deceit, and he absorbed it all. By adolescence, Ferdinand was already bitter. He wrote secret letters to sympathetic nobles, plotting how he might unseat Godwin and win the affection of his people. He performed loyalty in public and treachery in private. He hated his father for his weakness. He hated his mother for her dominance. But most of all, he hated that he was powerless, a prince in name, but not in deed. This cocktail of entitlement and emasculation created something dangerous. Ferdinand came to believe that power must be seized, and once seized, never shared. He learned to value secrecy over honesty, vengeance over justice, domination over diplomacy. And as he matured, these lessons manifested not only politically, but sexually. Even as a youth, Ferdinand's fascination with domination and humiliation began to show. Courtiers whispered about his awkwardness with women, his discomfort with vulnerability. Instead of love, he practiced scrutiny. Instead of partnership, he craved control. The Enlightenment, sweeping across Europe, offered new ideas: liberty, reason, progress. But Ferdinand, molded by an archaic court and a mother whose power came through manipulation, rejected all of it. To him, the Enlightenment wasn't a path forward. It was a threat, a revolution in disguise. And so, he dug his heels into absolutism, into religion twisted into repression, into masculinity defined not by virtue, but by domination. In his mind, Spain's destiny was not to evolve, but to remain his, frozen in time as he saw fit. He would become the defender of tradition, the hammer against reform that died, the king who would never be weak again. But beneath the rhetoric, the rot was already blooming. The court around him grew claustrophobic. He distrusted even his allies. He kept score of every slight, every whisper. He began building a mental palace of enemies and betrayals, many of them imagined. And through it all, he waited for his moment to rise, to strike, to rule. When Napoleon finally invaded and the royal family fractured, Ferdinand saw his chance. He courted the French, he maneuvered against his own father, and when the people cried his name in defiance of foreign rule, he tasted the sweet drug of public adoration. El deseado, the desired one. At last, the boy who had once watched from the shadows was now at the center of the stage. But what no one understood, not then, not yet, was that Ferdinand hadn't returned from exile reborn. He had returned untouched, untempered, a boy still raging in a world that humiliated him. The throne did not elevate him, it revealed him. And the child raised in suspicion, isolation, and manipulation would become a king forged in cruelty. A battered Spain stands on the brink of ruin. The French are retreating. The Peninsular War has carved scars into every Spanish province. The people cry for order, for identity, for their king. And they get him, Ferdinand VII, released from Napoleon's grasp and welcomed home as a messiah. In 1814, he crosses the border. Crowds cheer. Church bells ring. Viva el deseado, long live the desired one. But what returns to Madrid is not a savior. It is the carefully polished mask of one. Beneath it, a man who learned nothing in exile except how to hate better and trust less. Within weeks of his return, Ferdinand shatters the illusion. He abolishes the liberal constitution of 1812, crafted during his absence, one of the most progressive charters of its time. He declares its authors traitors. The Cortes is dissolved. Political prisoners are locked away. Torture returns. The Inquisition, which had begun to decay, is revived. The man hailed as Spain's hope becomes its warden. Ferdinand surrounds himself not with thinkers, but enforcers, sycophants, informants, and clergy who promise loyalty in exchange for influence. Dissent becomes treason. Enlightenment becomes blasphemy. The printing press, once a tool of reform, is now a weapon of propaganda. But political cruelty is only half the story. Behind palace doors, Ferdinand indulges himself with grotesque abandon. What had once been whispers about his twisted tastes, his voyeurism, his predatory appetites, now roars through the aristocratic underground. The king orders the decoration of private chambers with explicit art, images of humiliation, degradation, control. His personal collection includes erotic dolls, positioned in elaborate scenes. Courtiers speak of a secret room, velvet-draped, candlelit, with one-way mirrors, where young women were summoned not for conversation, but display. Some of these girls were little more than teenagers, selected from noble families, peasant villages, even convents, coerced by fear, bribed by gold, or handed over by ambitious parents. One French diplomat wrote privately, "The court of Spain has become a theater of sickness. Its king collects flesh the way others collect coins." What drove him? Some say trauma. Others say vengeance against the mother who shamed him, the court that mocked him, the age that passed him by. But deeper still, Ferdinand's cruelty was not impulsive, it was methodical. He enacted pleasure as punishment. Women were ordered to parade nude while he laughed, picking apart their bodies with infantile mockery. He was known to pit them against one another, awarding trinkets or favor based on obedience or suffering. His court became a warped reflection of his own psychology, paranoid, eroticized, cruel. And the people? They still waited, still hoped, even as hunger stalked the provinces, even as uprisings flared and were crushed, even as Spanish colonies in Latin America, sensing the weakness of their motherland, declared independence one by one. From Argentina to Mexico, revolution spread like wildfire. And Ferdinand, too absorbed in bedroom games and court theatrics, let it burn. He neither reformed nor fought effectively. He simply watched, insulated by flattery and flesh. When advisors warned him of rebellion, he shrugged. When generals begged for reinforcements, he asked for another girl. The empire collapsed while Ferdinand dined on perfumed dishes and composed decrees outlawing liberal thought. It is easy to imagine such a man as mad. But madness implies disorder. Ferdinand's reign was not chaotic, it was systematic decay. Every voice that challenged him was silenced. Every institution that balanced him was dismantled. Every vestige of dignity, in governance, in law, in morality, was dressed in drag and forced to perform. He became a sadist with a crown, a man who turned an entire nation into a stage for his appetites. Some still defended him, conservatives who feared liberalism more than tyranny, clergy who saw in him a divine defender of Catholic orthodoxy. But for the exiles, the imprisoned, the silenced, Ferdinand VII was not El Desado. He was El Monstruo, a living contradiction, deeply religious yet depraved, weak yet oppressive, obsessed with control, yet blind to consequence. In the private diaries of Spanish liberals, one phrase recurs: "The king rules through fear, but fears everything." And it was true. Ferdinand distrusted even his own shadows. He changed bedrooms regularly. He tested food for poison. He read reports from spies planted in noble families, monasteries, even theaters. He saw enemies in philosophers, poets, widows, schoolboys. He crushed reform with the same enthusiasm he crushed innocence. But repression is never sustainable. Spain, once a proud empire, now sagged under debt, internal revolt, and humiliation abroad. Its colonies slipped away, its thinkers fled, its dignity withered, and still he ruled, with trembling hands and greedy eyes. By 1820, the liberal revolution ignited again. Army officers mutinied. Cities rose. This time they forced Ferdinand to restore the constitution he once destroyed. But even then, his compliance was a mask. He bided his time. And in 1823, with French military help, he reversed it all once more. jailing the revolutionaries he had just promised to protect. It was whiplash politics, a kingdom gasping under a pendulum that swung from tyranny to hope and back again. By the end of this phase, the legend of Ferdinand as a restorer had died. What remained was a shell of a king, bloated, anxious, but still hungry, for control, for youth, for obedience. And so, as Spain withered beneath his rule, he built higher walls, curtains thicker, mirrors darker. The world outside could collapse. Inside, the only law was Ferdinand's will, and that will was perverse. A velvet-draped chamber, silent, but for the creaking floorboards and muffled weeping. Candlelight flickers against walls lined not with tapestries of triumph, but with paintings of bondage, of violated innocence, of domination turned into art. This is not a brothel. This is not a dungeon. This is the royal bedchamber of King Ferdinand VII. Behind these doors, Spain's most powerful man built a theater of degradation. Where women were props, pain was performance, and power meant absolute possession. Ferdinand's sexuality was not private. It was public spectacle hidden in plain sight, indulged by an entourage of servants, priests, and nobles too fearful, or too complicit, to intervene. Contemporary sources speak of a collection, women summoned not for conversation or companionship, but for exhibition. Chosen from noble houses, convents, and even among the lower classes, they were inspected like livestock. Some barely 16. Aides kept lists, names, measurements, preferences. Their bodies were noted, ranked, displayed, and once selected they were paraded, naked, silent, sometimes humiliated before assembled courtiers. Ferdinand would laugh, mock, point. He issued commands not like a lover, but like a torturer. He reveled in power over vulnerability, not just sexual, but emotional, spiritual. This was not a matter of lust. It was domination through intimacy. To him, pleasure was control. Control was God-given, and resistance, proof of guilt. He took particular delight in emotional contradiction, ordering women to smile while weeping, to sing while trembling. He was a king who performed sadism as theater, and his court watched, nodded, and stayed silent. One foreign diplomat, writing anonymously, described the palace as a place where the body was state property and innocence an inconvenience. But Ferdinand did not act alone. His physicians administered tonics to make him perform. His priests absolved him before his appetites had cooled. His advisors procured girls under the guise of political hospitality. This wasn't hidden corruption. It was systemic. Institutionalized exploitation dressed in velvet and powdered wigs. His obsessions grew darker with age. He began collecting erotic art, not in secret, but displayed in private corridors. Portraits of women gagged with ribbons. Painted scenes of domination, commissioned with disturbing specificity. He even maintained what courtiers whispered was a chamber of dolls. These were not children's toys. They were lifelike mannequins dressed in miniature garments, posed in sexualized positions. Some say he spoke to them. Others claim he punished them. It is impossible now to separate fact from rumor, but when the rumors are this consistent, this widespread, they carry the weight of psychological truth. In marriage, Ferdinand was no gentler. He wed 4 times, and each wife was younger and more terrified than the last. His second wife, Maria Isabel of Braganza, died young. Her letters, what little survive, hint at a life of emotional isolation and duties that left her weeping. His third, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, entered the marriage at 15. She was devout, reclusive, and horrified by Ferdinand's demands. Her confession records, later leaked, mention nights of coercion and religious shame. And yet, the pressure was constant. She was a queen. She must bear a child. That was her only function. When she failed, she was ridiculed, both by courtiers and by the man who defiled her. Ferdinand once reportedly declared at court, "What use is a wife who cannot give an heir? I should trade her for a mule." His marriage beds were not beds. They were altars of sacrifice, where desire met duty and no woman left unscathed. All the while, the church remained silent, because Ferdinand was, to the clergy, a bulwark against liberalism. A sinner, yes, but their sinner. Better a monstrous king than a republic. Better whispered abuse than open rebellion. So his perversion was sanctified, cloaked in incense and guarded by scripture. Even those who hated him politically dared not attack his private behavior publicly. To speak of the king's vices was to invite treason. Libel laws were strict, censorship brutal. The few who wrote about it, in satire, in allegory, were jailed, exiled, or disappeared. The people knew, but they couldn't speak. His court knew, but they bowed. And Ferdinand VII, bloated, aging, and consumed by his cravings, knew only one thing: that no one could stop him. This section of his life was not an exception. It was a reflection. The perversion of monarchy mirrors the perversion of state. In Spain, the body politic was treated much like those women: humiliated, silenced, used. Laws were issued like caresses, short-lived, conditional, easily revoked. Promises were made only to be shattered in favor of impulse. Obedience was demanded, not earned. Consent was mocked. To understand Ferdinand's sexual tyranny is to understand his political doctrine. He believed he owned everything: the land, the law, the church, the people, their daughters. And for a time he did. His reign is often footnoted in textbooks: reactionary, absolutist, traditionalist. But such words sanitize the reality. What they obscure is the rot beneath the robes: a man who ruled not by divine right but by appetites left unchecked. This was not the misbehavior of a wayward king. It was the systematic conversion of power into private theater. Ferdinand made Spain his bedroom, and in doing so he turned the throne into a bedpost and the crown into a mask. When we remember him today, it is not through grand battles or majestic reforms. It is through whispers of naked girls trembling in candlelight, of royal doctors silencing sobs with wine, of a king giggling in the dark as an empire withered just beyond the velvet walls. There are many ways to destroy a nation. Ferdinand chose the slowest, most intimate way possible: to possess it, until nothing remained but silence. Power, when driven by appetite, rarely stops at the bedroom door. For Ferdinand VII, the monarchy itself became a mirror, reflecting the same pattern of indulgence, domination, and moral decay. While the king amused himself behind thick curtains and crimson sheets, Spain bled. Once one of the greatest empires in the world, stretching from the Andes to the Philippines, Spain in the 19th century was a broken vessel, and Ferdinand, its captain, steered by desire rather than duty. He returned to the throne in 1813 as a supposed hero. The Spanish people, weary of Napoleonic rule and foreign humiliation, welcomed him with open arms. They called him El Deseado, the Desired One. They thought he would restore liberty. But Ferdinand did not come home to govern. He came home to possess. Within weeks, he abolished the Constitution of 1812, a progressive document born out of struggle and war. He dissolved the Cortes, the parliament, and declared absolute rule. It was as if the flames of revolution had never touched Spanish soil. But Ferdinand did not use his renewed power to lead. He used it to stall, silence, and gorge. While young men starved, he ordered feasts. While newspapers were shuttered, his ministers printed flattering verses praising his virility. While priests were imprisoned for liberal sermons, royal physicians scoured the countryside for yet another innocent girl to warm his bed. His Spain was a theater of repression. The Inquisition was quietly revived, its dungeons filled once more with those accused of impiety, liberalism, or merely writing the wrong pamphlet. Torture returned, not for faith, but for control. Every revolt, and there were many, was crushed not with reform but with terror. Dissenters were exiled, executed, or branded traitors. The prisons overflowed. But the most catastrophic consequence of his rule wasn't domestic. It was global. Spain lost nearly all of its colonies in Latin America during Ferdinand's reign. From Mexico to Argentina, liberation movements surged forward, movements once held at bay by the promise of reform from the Spanish crown. But under Ferdinand, there was no reform, only regression. He refused to compromise. He refused to adapt. He refused to care. He dismissed colonial grievances as indigenous tantrums. He sent underfunded armies, led by corrupt generals, into wars they could not win. And he remained, unbothered in Madrid, sketching indecent caricatures in the margins of state decrees, some say. By the 1820s, The Spanish Empire had shattered. Over 300 years of imperial conquest, undone not by guns alone, but by the apathy of a king too obsessed with pleasure to protect his own legacy. Foreign diplomats remarked that Ferdinand governed as if the kingdom were a harem, and his ministers eunuchs to his moods. It was a damning observation, but it was accurate. His court had become a parody of monarchy. Noble titles were traded for favors. Appointments were sold. Merit was mocked. His mistress's relatives received governorships. His friends' illegitimate children inherited noble houses. Even military decisions were influenced by bribes, rumors, or bedroom whispers. One particular scandal involved the governor of a major province, appointed after a single dinner with Ferdinand's current lover, whose family had promised him entertainment in return. The governor was incompetent. The province revolted. Ferdinand did nothing. He did not see rebellion as a threat. He saw it as background noise, the cries of a distant land, irrelevant to the games he played in bed. And so Spain burned. In villages, the people whispered prayers not to be governed, but simply to be left alone. In cities, murals were painted in the night, satirical images of the king, bloated and laughing, seated atop piles of gold and naked corpses. And in salons, once filled with enlightenment debate, silence replaced speech. Because to speak truth was to risk exile. To demand change was to vanish. Ferdinand's Spain was not just politically repressive. It was spiritually suffocating. Artists fled. Writers published in secret. Philosophers hid their manuscripts behind false walls. All while Ferdinand read pornographic literature in bed, surrounded by servants trained to feed him grapes, stroke his ego, and remove his slippers with ceremonial grace. This grotesque contrast, between a collapsing nation and a king lost in silk, became the defining image of his rule. But what makes Ferdinand's reign particularly tragic is not just his cruelty. It is his waste. This was a man who had power, real, sweeping power, at a time when Spain could have been rebuilt. After Napoleon's retreat, Spain stood at a crossroad. It could have reformed, modernized, healed. But Ferdinand refused. He saw every compromise as weakness, every liberal as an enemy, every change as an insult to his divine right. And so he chose the past. He chose nostalgia over progress, tyranny over dialogue, sensation over strategy. He ruled not like a man entrusted with a nation's soul, but like a child given too many toys. A boy in a palace of dolls, breaking each one in turn and crying when they no longer moved. Spain would not recover quickly. His policies left the economy in ruins, the military demoralized, and the public disillusioned. His ministers, chosen for loyalty rather than competence, bankrupted entire regions. Infrastructure crumbled, education collapsed, hospitals closed, and through it all, Ferdinand remained untouched. Because what protected him was not love, but fear. He ruled through a combination of divine propaganda and brutal suppression, presenting himself as the chosen guardian of Spain's traditions, while burying those traditions beneath his personal decay. It was monarchy as illusion, government as masquerade. Behind every velvet curtain was a jail cell. Behind every royal portrait, a body. Behind every cheer, a gag. As this section closes, the viewer must confront an uncomfortable truth. Ferdinand VII's lust was not confined to flesh. He lusted after silence, after obedience, after permanence. He wanted not just to be king, but to be the only voice in the room, the only shadow on the wall, the only name that mattered. And for a time, he was. Imagine, it is the year 1829. In the cold marble halls of the royal palace in Madrid, a girl stands still as a statue. She is 23. He is 45, grotesquely bloated, rotting from the inside, and crowned by divine right. Her name is Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. His is Ferdinand VII, King of Spain. The wedding is not a celebration. It is an arrangement, a transaction carved in flesh and sealed in gold. She was his fourth wife, his final bride, a last desperate attempt to produce a male heir. But behind the pomp and ritual, this marriage was a grotesque farce. A child tied to a monster, her body made a vessel for dynastic panic and perverse control. Ferdinand by now had descended almost completely into parody. Bloated and bedridden, with gout gnawing at his legs and abscesses forming beneath his folds of fat, He ruled from a room lined with mirrors and erotic paintings. His attendants powdered his decaying skin, doused his stench with perfume, and flattered him with lies. He was, they told him, still a virile lion. And so, like an aging beast, the king chose one last cub, not for love, but for utility. Maria Cristina was selected from a short list of European princesses, her bloodline Catholic, her womb untested. She was soft-spoken, devout, and painfully obedient. But she was also shrewd, far more than her youthful face betrayed. To her, this was survival. To him, it was conquest. Within weeks of the wedding, the palace doors closed around her. Her letters were censored. Her movements monitored. She was paraded at court, praised for her virtue, her submission. But behind the marble and lace, she was alone. Married not to a man, but to a shadow that consumed everything around it. Ferdinand, unable to perform without cruelty, turned their marriage into a twisted theater of power. He bragged publicly about his bedroom victories, despite clear signs of impotence. He mocked her in front of courtiers, only to shower her with jewels the next day. Some days, he refused to speak to her. Other nights, he insisted she sleep beside his festering body, as physicians stood by with smelling salts and sedatives. He did not want a wife. He wanted a symbol, an icon of purity beside his depravity, a doll with a pulse, a virgin queen to cleanse a rotten throne. But Maria Cristina endured, and in 1830, against all expectations, or perhaps by divine irony, she gave birth to a daughter, Isabella d'Anjou. It was not the son Ferdinand had hoped for, but it was enough. The king, temporarily satisfied, declared Isabella the heir to the Spanish throne, a radical act in a kingdom where women were traditionally barred from succession. And in doing so, he ignited the fury of Spain's ultra-conservatives, who had long pinned their hopes on Carlos, the king's reactionary brother. They saw Maria Cristina as an outsider, a schemer, a threat to Spain's masculine order. But Ferdinand no longer cared. He had his heir. He had his girl. He had, in his mind, secured his legacy, not through greatness, but reproduction. And yet, as his body continued to rot, his paranoia deepened. He feared assassination. He feared Carlos. He even began to fear Maria Cristina herself. He suspected her of plotting, of poisoning his food, of praying for his death. His bedroom was lined with guards. His wine was tasted thrice. His physicians were replaced weekly. Still, Maria Cristina remained by his side, not out of love, but necessity, because she had learned the most dangerous truth in that palace. Survival depended on performance. She became what the court demanded, the grieving wife, the loyal consort, the Madonna in mourning silks. But beneath the veil, she was calculating. She read foreign newspapers in secret. She met with moderates. She kept detailed records. She was not only thinking of her husband's death, she was preparing for it. In September of 1833, that moment finally came. Ferdinand, now so deformed he could not walk, lay in his royal bed, gasping for breath. His final days were filled with seizures, fever dreams, and terrified moans. Some said he screamed the names of women he had hurt. Others said he begged for priests, then spat on them. Maria Cristina held his hand. She kissed his forehead, and when he finally died, surrounded by opulence and rot, she did not weep. She signed a decree declaring Isabella II the rightful Queen of Spain and herself regent. In a single stroke, she erased the shadow of her husband and stepped into power, not as his puppet, but as his successor. But the court did not forget. Even as Maria Cristina ruled with caution and political cunning, she remained haunted by whispers that she had married a beast, that her daughter was born of royal corruption, that her hands were stained with silent complicity. She spent the rest of her life battling both rebels and memories. She would be overthrown, exiled, return, and exiled again. Her daughter's reign would be marred by scandal, and her own legacy would be tangled in contradiction. Some saw her as a survivor, others as a schemer. But no one could ignore the ghost she had once shared a bed with. Ferdinand VII, the king who turned marriage into monarchy's darkest ritual, the man who believed that youth could redeem tyranny, the tyrant who used a girl to crown his grave. As this section ends, we are left not with horror, but with stillness. The stillness of a royal bed after death. The silence of a young queen sitting beside the body of her captor, lover, kingdom. And the knowledge that power, true, unchecked power, never just ruins nations. It ruins people. Imagine, the king is dead, the velvet curtains are drawn, candles flicker over a corpse bloated with disease, swaddled in gold-trimmed linen. Outside, bells toll for Ferdinand VII, a monarch of Spain. But no one in the streets weeps. They watch in silence, not out of reverence but exhaustion. There is no national mourning, no eruption of grief, only a heavy, brittle quiet, as if the country is waiting to breathe again. Ferdinand died in 1833, surrounded by grotesque opulence and the scent of incense masking decay. He left behind no victories, no golden age, no noble legacy, only a broken empire, a traumatized court, and a child queen. He also left behind a question, one whispered in halls for generations. How much ruin can one man cause, simply because he was never told no? Ferdinand was never a conqueror. He was never a great reformer, nor a warrior, nor a builder of nations. His reign was not defined by brilliance, but by the absence of resistance, by courtiers who flattered him, physicians who indulged him, subjects who feared him, a nation that mistook bloodline for leadership. This was a man who mistook desire for destiny, who believed the throne not only excused his appetites but enshrined them. And so the kingdom followed. Ferdinand's sexual cruelty was not a footnote, it was policy. His fetish for domination echoed in dungeons. His lust was mirrored by state repression. His fear of female autonomy mirrored his fear of political freedom. Everything became submission, from his child brides to his ministers, from young girls paraded for his pleasure to generals, forced to swear oaths of blind loyalty. Spain under Ferdinand was not ruled, it was possessed. And possession corrodes. By the time he died, Spain had lost most of its colonies in the Americas. Its economy was shattered, its monarchy distrusted, its people bitter and fragmented. But Ferdinand's true legacy is not in what was lost, it's in what was allowed. The indulgence of absolute power, unchecked and uninterrogated. The normalization of cruelty behind silk drapes. The way palace walls can muffle screams and turn abuse into ritual. His life reminds us that depravity does not always announce itself with fire and blood. Sometimes it creeps in gently, wrapped in ritual, perfume, and holy oil. Sometimes it is crowned. And sometimes it is inherited. Because after Ferdinand, the war did not end. His death triggered the Carlist Wars, a bloody conflict over succession that tore Spain apart. His own brother rose in revolt, claiming the throne Ferdinand had wrenched from tradition. His daughter Isabella II would inherit a broken nation and a poisoned name. Even dead, he ruled through trauma. Even in silence, he whispered. So what are we to make of Ferdinand VII, history's most perverted king? Was he a victim of a twisted court? A product of emotional neglect? A man shattered by paranoia, spoiled by power, warped by fear? Yes, and also no. Because beyond the psychology, beyond the tragedy, lies the harder truth. He was a monarch who chose his pleasures over his people, and a nation paid for it. There is no monument to Ferdinand VII that still draws crowds. No epic poem, no glowing statue, only archives, faded portraits, and stories whispered by historians who dare to look beneath the lace and jewel. His reign stands as a warning that unchecked power does not only distort those who hold it, it cripples those forced to endure it. He was called El Deseado, the desired one. But in the end, Spain desired only to forget. And yet, here we are, remembering, not to glorify, not to gawk, but to understand, to remind ourselves that tyranny does not always arrive with armies and banners. Sometimes it crawls into the royal bedchamber and smiles.